So friends, a federal judge just found that the Trump administration is violating a court order to unfreeze certain federal funding. We are now this close to a true constitutional crisis. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, just when it seems like the federal courts are holding strong, we see headlines like this earlier today from Reuters. As Trump pushes legal boundaries, judges hold the line. You know, with judges one after another issuing injunctions and restraining orders, telling the Trump administration it must stop engaging in unlawful conduct, in unconstitutional conduct. Even a federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan 4 decades ago put a stop to Donald Trump's birthright citizenship executive order, saying that it appeared to be, quote, blatantly unconstitutional, just when it looked like the courts were holding strong and protecting the American people from Trump's attempted lawlessness and unconstitutionality. We see this breaking headline from the New York Times. Judge rules the White House failed to comply with court order. And that article begins, a federal judge on Monday said the White House has defied his orders to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time a judge has expressly declared that the Trump White House was disobeying a judicial mandate. The ruling by Judge John J. McConnell Jr. in Rhode Island federal court ordered Trump administration officials to comply with what he called the plain text of an edict, an order he issued last month. Judge McConnell's ruling marked a step toward what could quickly evolve into a high-stakes showdown between the executive and judicial branches, a day after a social media post by Vice President J.D. Vance claimed that, quote, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power, close quote, elevating the chance that the White House could provoke a constitutional crisis. But here is why J.D. Vance knows that what he is posting is at best misleading and at worst absolute bullshit. Whereas courts may not be able to control or weigh in on or put a stop to legitimate executive branch actions, legitimate presidential decisions. There's nothing legitimate about Donald Trump violating the Constitution or violating the law with these executive orders he has been, spewing out into the public square, one after another, some that even Republican-appointed judges have said are blatantly unconstitutional. That is precisely what courts are supposed to do, put a stop to illegal or unconstitutional conduct by a president or the executive branch. So I'm going to be generous and say J.D. Vance's nonsense there is wildly misleading, kind of bordering on misinformation or even propaganda. All my editorial comment. The article continues. Already more than 40 lawsuits have been filed against the Trump administration challenging Mr. Trump's brazen moves, which have included revoking birthright citizenship, contrary to the Constitution, and giving Elon Musk's team access to sensitive Treasury Department payment systems. Judges have already ruled that many of these executive actions may violate existing statutes or be blatantly unconstitutional, or both. Both Judge McConnell and a federal judge in Washington, D.C., had previously ordered the White House to unfreeze federal funds locked up by a memo from the White House Office of Management and Budget that demanded that billions of dollars in federal grants be held back until they were determined to comply with President Trump's priorities, including, get this, with ideological litmus tests. On Friday, 22 Democratic attorneys general went to Judge McConnell to accuse the White House of failing to comply with his earlier order. The Justice Department responded in a filing on Sunday that money for clean energy projects, as well as transportation infrastructure allocated to states by the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, was exempt from the judge's initial order because it had been paused under a different memo than the one that prompted the lawsuit. Judge McConnell's ruling on Monday explicitly rejected that argument. His initial order, he wrote, was, quote, clear and unambiguous, and there are no impediments to the defendants, the federal government, the Trump administration, compliance with it. The judge granted the Attorneys General's request for a motion for enforcement, essentially a nudge. It did not find that the Trump administration was in contempt of court or specify any penalties for failing to comply. So, friends, let me just reframe that last point. Judge John J. McConnell, Jr. found that the Trump administration violated his earlier order, but he didn't hold the Trump administration in contempt yet. Let's look at just a little bit of Judge McConnell's new court order. It's fairly short, and I'm only going to review about one page of it. Now, the states that brought this suit seeking injunctive relief, seeking to have a judge order them to stop this freeze and begin providing this federal funding again, the states, the state attorneys general, were from New York, California, Illinois, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, North Carolina, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and Wisconsin. Those are the plaintiffs in the case. And the defendant is Donald Trump and company. And friends, here is how Judge McConnell's order opens. Order. The plaintiff state's motion for enforcement of the temporary restraining order is granted. It is a basic proposition that all orders and judgments of courts must be complied with promptly, and yes, the judge put all of that in bold type. Persons who make private determinations of the law and refuse to obey an order generally risk criminal contempt, even if the order is ultimately ruled incorrect. The orderly and expeditious administration of justice by the courts requires that an order issued by a court with jurisdiction over the subject matter and the persons must be obeyed by the parties until it is reversed by orderly and proper proceedings. The defendants, Trump and company, the defendants issued a broad, categorical, all-encompassing directive freezing federal funding. The plain language of the TRO, that is the order Judge McConnell entered in this case, prohibits all categorical pauses or freezes in obligations or disbursements based on the OMB directive or based on the President's 2025 executive orders. The defendants, Trump and company, received notice of the TRO. The order is clear and unambiguous, and there are no impediments to the defendants' compliance with the order. The states have presented evidence in this motion that the defendants, in some cases, have continued to improperly freeze federal funds and refused to resume disbursement of appropriated federal funds. The defendants now plea that they're just trying to root out fraud. But The freezes in effect now were a result of a broad categorical order, not a specific finding of possible fraud. The broad categorical and sweeping freeze of federal funds is, as the court found, likely unconstitutional and has caused and continues to cause irreparable harm to a vast portion of this country. These pauses in funding violate the plain text of the TRO, that is, the temporary restraining order. And then, friends, just moving forward and wrapping it up, Judge McConnell says, therefore, consistent with the United States Constitution, United States statutes, United States Supreme Court precedent, and the TRO, the defendants, Trump and company, are hereby further ordered as follows. 1, the defendants must immediately restore frozen funding during the pendency of the TRO until the court hears and decides the preliminary injunction request. And then it goes on for another 5 paragraphs, essentially telling Trump and his administration, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. No excuses, no equivocating, no, we're just searching for fraud. Stop it. You are hereby ordered to stop it. Yes, all my characterization of what Judge McConnell said in the balance of his order. So now let's talk for a minute about why I said up front we are this close to a true constitutional crisis. That term, constitutional crisis, gets thrown around a lot, and I'll be the first to admit that, every minute Donald Trump is in power, it kind of feels like our Constitution is in crisis. But I think the most accurate definition of a true constitutional crisis is when you have 2 co-equal branches of government that are now butting heads. But one branch has the ultimate authority to make a decision, and it can impose that decision on the other branch. The other branch is required by our constitutional construct to abide by the decision made by the other branch of government. Concretely, what does that mean? Well, it means that when the Supreme Court rules that a president can't do something because it would be unconstitutional, the executive branch, the president and his administration, must abide by that Supreme Court ruling. The administration, the executive branch, must abide by lower court rulings as well, trial court rulings, appeals court rulings. They can't just thumb their nose at the judiciary and say, we're not abiding by your rulings. They can appeal those rulings all the way up to the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court decides to accept review of those lower court rulings. But the executive branch can't just refuse to comply with lawful court orders, even if they claim that, well, we're just out here as fraud hunters. So, we're not going to do what the federal judiciary tells us we can or can't do because it's unlawful or unconstitutional. That is a constitutional crisis. If the executive branch, the president and his administration, refuse to abide by the orders, the lawful orders of a co-equal branch of government, it's not like the judicial branch, the judiciary has an army or a law enforcement agency, and they can force the executive branch to comply with their rulings and their orders. It takes the goodwill and the honor and the integrity of the people who populate government to keep our Constitution alive, to keep our democracy as a viable, thriving form of government. But Donald Trump has been itching to plunge us into a true constitutional crisis, and it looks like he's this close. Why do I say he's just this close and he hasn't done it already? Because now that Judge McConnell has said, I find you violated my court order, but I'm not holding you in criminal contempt yet. Let's see what the next step is. Will it be a hearing on whether the Trump administration should be held in criminal contempt because they continue to violate this newly issued order that was handed down today saying, listen, you're violating the temporary restraining order I put in place. Stop it, stop it, stop it right now. Let's see how the Trump administration responds. Because here's the thing. The courts do have the power and the authority to hold even government officials in criminal contempt. The sanctions could include fines or even imprisonment. We're going to be talking more very specifically about what that would look like moving forward. But let me not bury the lead. The federal judiciary has very little appetite. It has proven over time to hold federal government officials in contempt, even for repeatedly and flagrantly violating lawful court orders. They have the ability to do it. They have the authority to do it. But to say they are hesitant to do it doesn't quite connote, how they try to avoid doing it. To say they're resistant to doing it is getting a little closer. Saying they're unwilling to do it, I don't think we're there yet, but we're going to be talking more in the future about precisely what that looks like moving forward if the Trump administration continues to just blatantly, flagrantly, knowingly, intentionally violate lawful court orders. And let me just preview this one issue for you, and then I think that's probably enough for today. The one issue is, who enforces court orders? It's the United States Marshal Service. And let me tell you, I worked with them for decades, and they are a crack outfit, really uniformly impressive. When you hear they always get their man or their woman, they really do. And here is, the law actually requires the U.S. Marshal Service to execute court orders, to help judges enforce court orders. But the Marshal Service is part of the executive branch. So technically, part of the Department of Justice under the control of the Attorney General ultimately and Donald Trump. So what if the law enforcement agency, the U.S. Marshal Service, that is obligated by law to help courts enforce their orders, what if those orders are to perhaps haul government officials, federal government officials into court and potentially even detain them if they are found to be in criminal contempt of court? People might say, well, yeah, the Marshal Service will just do whatever Donald Trump tells them to do or not to do. I'm not so sure. I think the success of Donald Trump's attempt to plunge us into a true constitutional crisis is dependent on how many people he can get to join in his, what I think is a de facto criminal conspiracy to violate our nation's laws and to violate the Constitution. How many of the men and women of government, we know the Republicans in Congress have laid down, right? They let Donald Trump walk all over them. For example, when Donald Trump fired 17 inspectors general, the internal watchdogs who are supposed to, keep an eye out for fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, crime in the executive branch, got rid of all of them, contrary to the federal law that requires 30 days advance notice to Congress. Congress is like, use us as a doormat. Mr. President, we don't care if you violated the law, that was designed to protect our interests as a co-equal branch of government, the legislative branch. We were supposed to get 30 days advance notice. They still haven't gotten notice. And he did this back on January 24th. So Congress is lying down. They're not protecting the American people. They're not upholding their oath. They're not loyal to the Constitution. They seem to be loyal to Donald Trump. I don't know that the good men and women of the U.S. Marshal Service would be willing to violate the law in favor of a lawless president or the conduct of a lawless administration in violating court orders. I don't think they would. I know and worked with those men and women. I don't think they would. But the success of Donald Trump's attempt to seize power and control of all branches of government is dependent on how many of the good men and women of the federal government are willing to join his de facto criminal conspiracy, his lawlessness. We're going to reach a tipping point. And here's what I will finish with. Let's hope that Donald Trump's newly minted Attorney General, Pam Bondi, abides by her oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, uphold the laws of the United States, rather than supporting and defending a president in his determination to violate the laws and violate the Constitution and have courts find that he violated the law, violated court orders. Let's hope Attorney General Bondi remembers that oath and stands up for the rule of law and stands up for the Constitution and stands up for the American people, rather than just standing by as Donald Trump tries to bring it all crashing down. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.